So today, I decided to tackle the question, can a complete beginner buy a dirt cheap bike and get around New York City? So there's a couple rules for this. Rule number 1, the bike can't be more than $100. Rule number 2, I'm going to message a bunch of people. And rule number 3, the first person to message back and set up a time and actually meet with me will be the one to get the money so I can get the bike. Now, the first episode of this series is going to deal with me actually buying the bike. The second episode is going to be what it's going to take to fix the bike, or if the bike needs any repairs, or what it means to get it roadworthy again. Third episode is going to be my tips and pointers for getting what's probably a better bike for your first time getting out on the streets of New York.
I'm going to use Craigslist. I've liked Craigslist. A lot of people hated it for a long time, but I feel like because not everyone uses it now, makes it a little better in some way. I don't know, maybe it's just a mental thing. But let's see. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get started. After a long and crazy search, this is what I ended up with. This bike is a Pure Cycles Fixie, or a Pure Fix. Now it's got a flip-flop hub, so what I decided to do was I decided to put it on the single speed side because I will not ride a Fixie, no. Now, there's a whole story behind how this bike came to be.
So here's what happened. Now, I messaged a bunch of people. Out of all these people, the first guy to message back was a guy named Eddie. Eddie messaged back and he said, if you got $100 and you come to Harlem, the bike is yours. I tried to bargain with Eddie. Eddie refused. So I took the train all the way up to Harlem, and then when I got to Harlem, after looking like this cool guy right here, I saw Eddie. When I found Eddie, I gave him $100 within 2 minutes, and the bike was mine. Now the plan was to take the bike and ride it the 10 miles back home to Brooklyn. But I realized the tires were flat. I went to Eddie. I said, hey Eddie, the tires are flat. And Eddie said, oh, nah, you got enough air to make it back home. Like the air was gasoline. And I said, okay, that's weird. So, for the first 2 blocks, I actually walked the bike. I walked it to a local bike shop. And then when I got to the bike shop, I realized the stems were too short for me to fit an air pump tube. So I had to pay the bike shop a couple bucks to get the tubes replaced. Once I got the tubes replaced, I got on the bike. And then I realized that the brakes were set wrong. The brakes were set to brake onto the tire. And these are rim brakes because tire brakes are not a thing. I went to this other bike shop, they charged me another couple bucks, and they adjusted the brakes for me. It still wasn't perfect, but after an hour and 40 minutes, I made it back home. And what a ride it was. Now, with that being said, even though I paid top dollar, I did not get a very good bike. There's a lot of problems with this thing. Now, first off, these brakes. These brakes have been the bane of my existence since I got this bike. They made me stop once, they still weren't fixed. Basically, the caliper itself moves, so the bike doesn't stop properly. Also, because the caliper itself moves, the brake pads refuse to stay in place, and the brake pads themselves are worn into a triangle. Yeah, a triangle. The second problem is these handlebars. These handlebars are black, sticky, and filthy. And they're white handlebar grips. I don't quite understand how that happened. But after I ride this bike, I have to wash my hands a couple times. It's not very sanitary. I don't know, I feel gross with this thing. Now the next set of issues I had. So I mentioned how the tires weren't filled with air when I first got them. The guy talked about it like it was a tank of gas or something. Well, I managed to pop the tube in this front tire again. So, once again, it's flat.
I just wanted to put a little more air in because it got a little flat after a couple days and it went poof. Cheap bikes. My new friend Eddie, he gave me a lock, but no key. My normal bike is a 55 centimeter frame. And when I ride it, it feels a tiny bit big. One thing that I do like about this bike is the fact that with this bike, I actually really like the seating position. It fits me perfectly. I have tiny legs and this is a smaller frame. It is great. Now, with that being said, the one issue that I have with this bike is that even though it's a smaller frame, it's weirdly a little bit heavier than my day-to-day bike. Now it's 8 centimeters smaller. That's a pretty good amount smaller for it to be heavier, but it is. And that brings me on to my second thing with this bike, is that there's a whole class of fixies and single speeds that are made to a certain price point. These are completely fine bikes. They're hardy, they'll last you a good amount of time, and they're great if you're a beginner. But what you'll notice is that the components, the handlebars, the seats, all this stuff, they're a little bit cheaper than what you'd anticipate. And that's because, again, they're made to a price point. So you'll need to upgrade them as you go along. And this is definitely one of those bikes. There's a couple things here that I would change to make it more comfortable, much more better to ride for myself. Now, the other annoying issue that this bike has is I can't ride it without taking my hands off the handlebars. It's kind of a flex, but I can ride a bike with no hands. But this one I can't because the wheels need to be trued. And so if I take my hands off, it scares me to death. The handlebars are constantly jiggling because the wheel isn't quite straight and the wheel is also jiggling. It's going to need a tune-up. A tune-up is basically the cost of the entire bike. So yeah, that should be fun. What's the plan for this bike? Well, over the next week, I'm going to take it to a bike shop. I'm going to have them fix the whole thing and then give you a breakdown of what the cost would be. That's going to be the second episode. The third episode, I'm going to give this bike away to a friend, and then we're going to talk about what you should look for when you are buying a bike for the first time. It's really easy to get ripped off. As you can see, when you buy a bike for cheap, it's maintained for cheap, and it shows. I don't know how people ride these things.